Thank you. This talk is the Prime Directive in the 21st century. The Prime Directive in the 23rd century, for those of you who are Star Trek fans, is summarized in General Order 1. No starship may interfere with the normal development of alien life or society. This is also known as the non-interference principle.
So when we get to the 21st century, we try to think about what the Prime Directive might look like in terms of economic freedom, and we offer this: no government may interfere with a person's free will except to prevent that person from imposing harm on others.
So when you think about economic freedom, it's basically two components. The first is individual choice. Individuals should be left alone to make decisions for themselves. The second is property rights, that they should be secure in their property. So together, this is what we call economic freedom. There's no good way to measure economic freedom, but there are several institutes that attempt to estimate economic freedom. My favorite is the Frazier Institute in Canada, and they measure economic freedom by looking at societies and asking questions like, what's the size of government, how much takings and discriminatory taxes are there, and how much labor market freedom is there. The more freedom you have in these spheres, the more the Frazier Institute registers you as having more economic freedom, so more individual choice, more property rights. The lower you rank on this scale, the less individual freedom, less personal choice, the fewer property rights you have. So Frazier's purpose is to look at societies and put a stamp on them, a metric that reflects the degree of economic freedom that's there. So what we're going to do is begin by looking at Frazier's measure of economic freedom for the 50 states. So we'll look over, this is the entire data set, currently ranges from 1985 through 2014. And what we're going to do is split the 50 states into two groups. The 25 that in each year are less economically free, and the 25 in each year that are more economically free. Over the course of these years, 1985 through 2014, the states you see here in red, in every single year, they end up in the more economically free category. The states you see here in blue, in every single year, they end up in the less economically free category. And then finally, these states, which is about 50% of the 50 states, go back and forth. California, for example, moves back and forth 8 times over the course of these years, sometimes in the less free category, sometimes in the more free category. What we're going to do here is, for each year, look at these two categories and ask questions about quality of life in the more free states versus the less free states. So let's begin with income. We'll measure income through median household income. And what you see here, these two bars are for 1984. The red bar represents the more free states. And you can see in 1984, adjusted for inflation, the more free states had a median household income of $56,900. In that same year, the less free states had a median household income of $56,600. So in 1984, the more free states had higher household income, median household income, than the less free states did. That's 1984. Here's 1985. You get the same kind of story. The more free states had median household income $55,100. The less free states had $54,900. 1986, it reverses. The less free states now have more income, the more free states have less income. But in 1987, it goes back. You can keep doing this for every single year. Compare the less free states to the more free states. And what you find, not in every year, but in 75% of the years, those more free states had higher median household income than the less free states did.
With poverty, we end up, and I should stop here and just say, my friend Antony only likes 2 things in the entire world: economics and Star Trek. And when I heard a couple of you guys laugh when the picture of the Ferengi went up, I got to tell you, you absolutely made his day. Because these are literally the only 2, and I've met his wife and children, these are the only 2 things he enjoys. But back to poverty. And with poverty, what you find, it's almost exactly the same story. In the more free states, the poverty rate much lower than in the less free states throughout the entire time, every year.
And if you convert the difference in these bars into human beings, what you find is that over this period, if the less free states had enjoyed the same poverty rate that the more free states did, in every year there would have been 5 million fewer Americans living in poverty. Now, we talked about income, we talked about poverty. A lot of people are concerned about income inequality, and many people erroneously say, well, yes, okay, economic freedom yields better income, less poverty, but it comes at a cost, and the cost is inequality. And then we kind of poo-poo inequality and say, well, we shouldn't be concerned about it. Take a step back and look at this. Now, the years are more restricted here. The reason the years are more restricted is because the Census Bureau only calculates inequality amongst the states periodically. So I'm showing you the entire data set that currently exists. And what you see here, up means more inequality, down means less inequality. So this is what the economists call the Gini Coefficient. It's a standard measure of income inequality. So up is bad, down is good. And you see here in 2006, this is how much inequality, as measured by the Gini Coefficient, existed amongst the less free states. In 2006, the more free states also exhibited income inequality, but it was actually less. In 2007, this is the inequality for the less free states. And in 2007, the inequality amongst the more free states was actually less. In fact, in every single year, inequality existed amongst the more economically free states, but it was less than the inequality that existed amongst the less economically free states.
And we can actually take the same approach and apply it to the countries of the world instead of just the states in the United States. And it shouldn't be terribly surprising by now that a very similar pattern starts to emerge when we do so.
So let's begin by talking about poverty. This is now poverty not amongst the states, but amongst the countries. So we have here the less free countries, and you can see the poverty rate is approaching 60%. The more free countries, the poverty rate is significantly lower, under 20%. And you look at this and you might say, well, yes, but that's obvious. What's going on here is that people in rich countries are less poor because they're rich, and also people in rich countries have the leisure to be concerned with things like freedom. So perhaps economic freedom and poverty have nothing to do with each other. They just both happen to be outcroppings of living in amongst a more rich society. That's a reasonable counterargument. The way to address it is to look only at the poorest countries and ask, what is the state of poverty amongst the poorest countries, for those that are less free, those that are more free? What you're seeing here, this is the poverty rate amongst the 20% the 20% poorest countries, and these are the least economically free of them. So of the 20% poorest countries, this is the half that are least economically free. And you can see the poverty rate, past 80%. It's gargantuan. Now look at this. Again, the poverty rate is astronomical. It's past 60%. But this is the poverty rate amongst the poor but economically free countries. And you see the same pattern here. Even amongst the poorest of the poor countries, those that are more economically free suffer less poverty than those that are less economically free.
With income inequality, we see precisely the same thing, and you're going to notice this happening quite a lot, right? In the less free countries, we're at about 42%, down about 35% in the more free countries. So again, the same pattern emerges even amongst, this is the poorest.
No, this is all countries.
This is all the countries in the world, so let's switch over.
Gender inequality, same kind of thing. Now the story here, gender inequality numbers come from, this is the United Nations Development Program. So they look at all the countries of the world periodically, and they ask questions about gender equality. What is the quality of life for women versus men? Income for women versus men, right? What fraction of positions of power are held by women versus men? And they put a stamp on the country that represents the degree of gender inequality. And what you see here is amongst the less economically free countries, you have more gender inequality than you do amongst the more economically free countries.
With child labor, the same pattern emerges yet again. We see quite a lot more child labor in the less free countries than in the more free countries, as we would expect.
Now, the comeback to this is to say, well, yes, what's going on here is you have less child labor amongst the more economically free countries, because what do you do if you're a heartless capitalist in a more economically free country? You'd love to employ children, right? They're small, they have little hands to get into things, they're not good at negotiating labor contracts. These are people you would love to employ, but you can't because you're in a rich country, and the rich country has child labor laws that prevent this sort of thing. So what does the heartless capitalist do? You export the child labor by building a factory in some poor country and employing their children. Now, if that story is true, what we should see is, if we look at the poorest countries, those that are more economically free, that is, those in which the government has a more hands-off approach, they should have higher rates of child labor because they don't have the government stepping in and restricting labor markets. And what you should see amongst the poor countries that have less economic freedom, you should see less child labor, if that story is true. But here's the actual data. This, again, is the poorest 20% of countries on the planet. On the left, poor but economically unfree. On the right, poor but economically free. And you see very high child labor rates. But again, the same pattern. The child labor rates amongst the more economically free countries are less.
You want to go back a slide?
You want to go backwards?
Yeah.
Why?
Go back a slide.
Okay.
Because you owe me money. Nobody got your joke.
Does anybody get this joke? Oh, for God's sake. That's also obvious, right? It's a thing, if you're into Star Trek, that every time they have an action sequence and they bring in the body doubles, they look nothing like the actual characters. This is supposed to be William Shatner. Yeah.
You find that Ant's humor goes about 4 steps too far down the road and everybody always misses it.
I have to explain it. We had a $20 bet that there would be snickering in the audience when I showed this. So
No
you let me down.
No child labor in my
You all
house this week.
collectively owe me a drink.
Actually, when we apply the same sort of analysis, we find that the same patterns hold true in cities as well. So here we have income with the least free cities and the most free metropolitan areas. This is America specifically,
Yeah,
correct?
cities within the United States.
And what do we see in the least free? The income level is just below 50,000, about 55,000, give or take, in the most free.
Yeah, and what's interesting here, these numbers are cost of living adjusted. Same is true for poverty rate. This is poverty rate amongst cities in the United States. On the left, those that are ranked less economically free. On the right, those that are ranked more economically free. And again, you see a lower poverty rate on the right-hand side. So here's the conclusion. We've looked across states, across countries, across cities, and across time. And no matter how you slice it, you find that societies with more economic freedom have higher standards of living, less poverty, less income inequality, less gender inequality, and less child labor. And if that concerns you, it should, because in the back of your head you should be worried that free people will act selfishly. And this is true. More freedom means a greater ability to exploit. It means a greater ability to harm each other. But more freedom also means a greater ability to cooperate and a greater ability to help each other. And this, ladies and gentlemen, suggests the appropriate role of government in society to prevent people from doing that and to do nothing else. This is the non-interference principle. Don't interfere in people's free will except insofar as to prevent them from harming each other. And that should be the prime directive for the 21st century. If you like this discussion, I encourage you to take a look. Oh, no, this
Take a look at the Declaration of Independence.
Declaration of Independence, yeah.
That's right. Because, all right, we've just presented, obviously Antony always skips this because he's an economist, but I, as a political scientist, this is about where I zero right in. And we've presented a lot of things today that would indicate why, pragmatically, you might want to think that freedom is the way to go, right? Freedom yields all kinds of good results. But there's more. Not only is freedom good for you, it's also good simply. And it's good simply for a lot of the reasons that Jefferson presents in the first couple of paragraphs here, or even that John Locke gives us in the second treatise of government. And it boils down to an understanding of simple human equality if we're all equal. And who among us would say that we're not, right? If we're all equal, then it naturally follows that none of us have the right, not a natural right of any kind, to lord over any of the rest of us, but by the consent of the others. Human equality yields this result. And if we're all equal, and this is the result, then human freedom is literally the only answer you can have from this philosophical perspective. So not only is freedom good for you, it's also a moral requirement if we're all equal. So I leave it to you to decide if you think that that's correct or not.
If you enjoyed this, I recommend to you this podcast, Words and Numbers. James and I produce this in association with our good friends at FEE. We come out every Wednesday around noon with a 15-minute episode in which we discuss some issue of the day that's relevant to economics or politics or human behavior in general. Do you have something more you'd like to add? I can't make it work.
There you go. That's always Ant's problem. You can't make it work. And if you're really, really interested, talk to us about this, because in conjunction with FEE, Ant and I and a friend of ours, Tom, who's in and out of the back, set up this 501c3 called Freedom Trust. And in a partnership with FEE, we bring these messages to high schools around the country. We travel this year. We should be in 50 different high schools this year, largely public schools. And we talk about economic freedom through the lens of politics, philosophy, and economics. So be happy to talk to you about that too.
We have a few minutes for questions.
Should I go to the mic?
I think they want you to go to the mic. Yes, please.
I studied economics at the University of Washington with Paul Hayne back in the early 80s. And one thing I see the difference between what went on back then and what's now is I think we've really lost some of the, particularly with healthcare. And when you guys go to your high schools, how do you address the healthcare debate? Because when I talk about it with people today, everyone trumps or tries to trump an argument by saying, well, I think people have a right to health care, and government should give it to them. And, and then you try to explore this issue a little bit further, and they talk about how the poor pay for health care because we've made it so expensive with all our regulations. How would you guys, as political scientists and as an economist, try to turn that argument around into a winning argument rather than into a
Right. Right. So how to explain healthcare? Do you want to take the right part?
I don't think so.
Okay. So
look, we argue quite a lot on healthcare and whether we should dip our toes into that pool, because it's incredibly complicated, right? And it seems almost to be the case that it's impossible to be an expert in healthcare. And we can't pretend to be experts in healthcare because we're not, right?
I can pretend.
You could pretend.
So let me pretend and tell you a few things that I do tell when people ask. The first, there are two issues here that you raised. The first one is, how do you deal with people who say that people should have a right to health care? I caution people to be very, very careful in using that word right. We have a tendency to use it as an adjective that means good. Yes, clearly health care is good, and yes, clearly this is something that people should have and people would be better off having it, right? But to say it's a right opens up a whole new can of worms. Because to say that something is a right says that the government has legitimate authority to come in and set things proper that aren't. So if I'm not receiving health care and I have a right to health care, we have then said, by using the word right, that the government should have the ability to come in and force someone else to provide me that health care. Now, at a very low level, it could be something as like the government imposing a tax on people, taking money out of their pocket and using it to pay for my health care. And people usually look at that and they think, well, that's not too bad of a thing. But what concerns me less than the thing is the principle. The principle you have established is that the government should be able to force you to give me this thing that you've claimed I have a right to. Now, what do we do when there's not enough money out there? Or what do we do if there are not enough doctors? What we have said, in effect, is the government should have the ability to force people to study medicine and then force them to provide me with health care. That is what comes of saying it is a right. So I caution people not to use that term unless they really mean what those consequences are. The second thing is the economics of the thing. We made a mistake. We, the United States, made a mistake with the Affordable Care Act. And the mistake at a fundamental level is we saw a problem, the rising cost of health care, and we asked, what can the government do to fix this? That was the wrong question. The right question was, what is the government doing to encourage this? We should have identified that first. And there are a number of things that were going on. Situations in which established large insurers or groups of medical professions, specialists, co-opted the regulatory state to force insurance companies or to provide insurance for things that people maybe didn't want or wanted electively. But the net result was that this regulatory interference pushed the price of medical care higher than it would have been otherwise. If you want some examples of this, look at the few things that aren't covered by insurance. The cost of LASIK surgery, for example, LASIK surgery largely is not covered by insurance. It's fallen over time, the same way that all technologically based things in our society, the prices have been falling over time. You mentioned...
Yeah, you could also look at veterinary care.
Veterinary,
right. Which is really quite interesting because it's a very big market, the government's not in it, and the prices as a result have remained relatively affordable over time. I mean, you know, clearly there's an option with pets that we don't have with humans, which also depresses the cost, so you have to be careful about these things. But the simple fact that that market exists, that there's private insurance within that market, that private insurance is incredibly affordable, and on and on and on, is actually quite instructive. And then when you take a look at the other side of the equation, and you start thinking about what single-payer healthcare looks like, which is clearly the direction we're going in, you know, the question that we typically ask is, how do you like the care at the Veterans Administration hospitals? Because that's a single-payer system, right? Now you've got what you want.
This question is for Professor Davies. Which Star Trek captain was the most freedom-friendly?
Which Star Trek captain was the most freedom-friendly?
Correct.
Oh.
It's Janeway.
Janeway? No. I don't know the answer to that, because when you say which Star Trek captain, the obvious answer is Kirk.
I'm a Picard guy for obvious reasons. Can you push a little closer to the mic? We can't hear you.
I'm Canadian. I work in the Canadian healthcare system, so it's not, from my perspective, it's not totally bad. It works in its way. But the question is simply, well, to one comment and a comment afterwards. You know, a healthcare crisis is the same as having your house on fire, being mugged. We accept the fact that the state will help you if your house is on fire, you're being mugged. It's fire department or the police department. So is a healthcare catastrophe not the same thing? Just a thought. A second, going on the way of it, have you seen the Hayek Keynes rap review?
Sure.
You want to take
I wasn't catching the question.
I honestly don't know. Look, you offer that in the spirit of an open question, and I don't know, right? On the one hand, you see where there would be a motivation to approach this in much the same way that you would, let's just say, fire services, right? There's fire, oh my God, you call the fire department and you fully expect the fire department to come. And yet there's a cost issue here as well, right? I wonder, kind of flipping your question on its head, what we would do if fire departments cost what healthcare costs, right? And if it were literally impossible ever to satisfy the demand. And I honestly don't know. I don't know what the right answer is.
If you had a 2-week wait.
I just don't know. you come a little closer to the mic?
Oh, I mean, just closer to the
just
mic.
to the mic.
Speak up, yeah.
Hello, I'm Bob, I'm a college student. I enjoy your talk immensely. I have two questions. One is regarding the Star Trek theme of the presentation. Some have argued that Star Trek is sort of the ultimate utopian, egalitarian, socialist sort of vision. What you as a free market economist have to say about that? And second, in regards to the discussion on inequality, I've noticed that some commentators are saying that inequality is an issue, but our understanding of free markets and inequality and free markets is a bad thing for inequality is mistaken. And some would argue that our problem with inequality itself is mistaken because inequality is a neutral thing. It's the issue that some people are poor enough and others are richer.
It's actually interesting that you would ask this, because we started doing a little bit of research on this just in the last week or two for an article that we've got coming out in the next month or so on inequality in America. And the thing that we've been noticing is a lot of people are claiming, come to find out correctly, that inequality is on the rise, right? So that was a little surprising. We didn't exactly expect to find that answer. But when we crawled into the data, that's exactly the answer we found.
Within the United States.
Within the United States. This is purely an American argument. So inequality is, in fact, on the rise. The critics are absolutely correct. At the same moment that inequality is on the rise, the rich are getting richer, as the common saying goes, but the poor are not getting poorer. The poor are getting richer too. So what we've got is a level of growth with a delta that's growing. Everybody's doing better, and the rich are doing proportionately better even still. And then the questions get to be quite different, right? Now the question isn't, is this inequality somehow unfair or unjust, although you could ask that. I think you have to ask, is this inequality fundamentally unfair or unjust, given that the position of the poor is improving over time too, right? Which is just a more complex question and a much better one.
And I think one of the problems that we have whenever we talk about inequality, we look around us and we see the poor and we see the rich, and we say, here's inequality. And you're taking a snapshot in time. If you observe people over time, what you will find is that over time, a lot of these people who today are rich, in the future will be poor. A lot of these people who are poor in the future will be rich, right? Some will be middle class. There's a lot of movement back and forth. In fact, in preparation for this article, we found some data indicating that almost 60% of Americans will spend at least 1 year amongst the top 10%. And something like 12% of Americans will spend at least 1 year amongst the top 5 or 4%, right? So there's tremendous amount of churn. So if you want to talk about inequality, what we need to do is look over time and ask the question not who's the rich and who's the poor today, but over the course of a person's life, what's the total income this person generates versus the total income that other people generate. Now you'll still find inequality, but you'll find it to be markedly less than the inequality you find when you just take a snapshot.
So you want to address socialism in Star Trek?
Yes, socialism in Star Trek. So one of the problems here is that Star Trek is, all of the series are from the perspective of people who are officers and crew on a starship. If you pick a Navy vessel and look at it today, you're going to find what looks like a socialist system, right? You can go and they'll feed you and you have a bunk that's taken care of. You don't have to pay the captain for your berthing space, right? So of course it looks socialist. Well, that's the perspective here. Now, if you look at any of these Star Trek episodes and you don't look at the people on the ship, but you look at the people on the planet, you find that no, actually it's not a socialist system, right? There's a lot of capitalism going on. Having said all of that, there's nothing wrong with socialism.
Whoa, who are you?
There's nothing wrong with socialism. What's wrong is when the government enforces it. If it's voluntary, and there's plenty of good examples, monasteries, even families, every family is a voluntary socialist system. There's nothing wrong with it if it's voluntary. The problem is when the government says this must be your system. And notice something fun here. The fun thing is that given that perspective, socialism, a socialist enclave, can exist within a larger free market enclave without any problem. But a free market enclave cannot exist within a larger socialist enclave. The imposed socialism won't tolerate it.
My family is authoritarian. Authoritarian.
I have a question that'll actually connect this to foreign policy, folks who were in here from the previous session, to that presentation. It seems like there's a natural extension from the non-intervention directive that could be applied to America's foreign policy. And I'm going to hazard a guess that a good chunk of those less economically free countries in the world happen to be countries that America probably has some hostilities or hostile stances against, or maybe that they've had some interventionist policies towards. So I'm just wondering if you guys can give us the economic benefits that could come about from having a more restrained foreign policy and applying this to that realm as well.
Good.
Yeah, I think if your goal is to liberate people, that is, make them free, treating them and their economy as freely as possible is how you get there, right? We've had the embargo on Cuba, or had the embargo on Cuba, for over 50 years, and it had no effect on people's freedom there. If instead we had traded with them freely, I think we would have seen the demise of the communist system there 30, 40 years ago. Because what happens when you trade freely, not only do you help people improve their standard of living, and in general, people who have a higher standard of living can demand more in terms of accountability from their government than people who are trying to live hand to mouth. But also, they start to see directly, well, look at what these people have over in this country. How come we don't have that? Right? And they start to put pressure on their own government.
And it's even more than that, because what you end up finding as well is that the free exchange of ideas goes with the products and the goods and the services. And when people start to think things through, they arrive at their own conclusions, and pressure from within is always better, I would say, than pressure from without. And absent some sort of kind of what we would call the Nazi problem, right? Somebody rifling through Europe in the 20th century, just as an example. Absent that sort of exigent crisis, maybe it's best to trade with people and get into their heads that way.
First comment, the opposite's obvious. Benjamin Sisko, Deep Space Nine, is the only part of the Star Trek universe that involves commerce. My other question is serious. When it comes to healthcare, we're always arguing apples and kumquats. We compare our system, which we think we know, with the European system, which somehow we assume is similar to ours. For example, I'm constantly hearing infant mortality rates. United States, a 3-month-old preemie is a dead baby. In many of European countries, a 3-day-old baby is not a dead baby. So why are the guys like you, economists and a political science guy, why aren't we getting some kind of realistic comparisons and putting them before the public so they realize we're not choosing the great European system? They don't realize that as you get older, you're denied care, period.
Right.
Based on dollars of cost. Nobody tells them this. They don't realize that if you think the death panels in Obamacare might have been potentially devastating, in Great Britain it's $35,000 a year. And when they didn't have a cancer doctor that could see most of the cancer patients, they created one called the screening oncologist, where you take a 100-question quiz, and now you make life and death decisions on people with cancer, on whether they get palliative care or cancer care. So I'm just thinking there's a lot of work to be done by guys like you. I'm just letting the American people have a clue as to the differences in our healthcare system and the European system once we get out of the clinical health care.
Yeah, do you have it?
Yeah, and
Right.
look, I couldn't, what's your name? Richard, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. Somebody's got to do it. I'm just not convinced it's us, right? And for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which is the utter complexity of the question itself, right? And it doesn't look as complicated as it is, because we look at Europe and we look at Canada, and these places look like us. And we know that we can survive in that society quite well, and we have the same cultural mores and things like this. And then yet, where the rubber meets the road on issues like this, the differences are unbelievable. And then when you start looking, you say, okay, well, I'll get my hands around all those other places after I figure out my own. And then you sit down and you say, and we've tried to do this, right? We've tried to write brief 700-word articles on healthcare in the United States. And we don't think that we can get clarity on any of it well enough to address even a slice of it in any one place, right? And we were talking about this earlier today, that this would probably take us 12 volumes of books to address correctly, instead of just sitting down and writing a series of articles to make sense of it all, primarily because we just can't seem to get our fingers deep enough into the subject matter to do it. Now, I'll let Ant follow up with what he's got.
Now, James is a philosopher, which means he wants to do this right. I'm an economist. I'm happy to assume all kinds of things and just tell you a few stories. So I'll tell you a few stories that they don't do what James wants, which is tell you the whole picture, but it does poke some holes that will cause you to think that realize there's more to this than people realize. For example, you talk about the infant mortality rate, and part of the reason we have problems with data here is because we must rely on what the governments themselves report. And the governments on various countries report child mortality differently. In this country, if a child is born and dies 6 hours later, that's an infant mortality. In Germany, the child has to survive for at least, I don't know what it is, 1 week, 2 weeks, something, and then dies, then it's counted as child mortality. Because if the child dies earlier than that, it is not counted. So immediately there's a difference in definitions that's biased against us. Another interesting thing with child mortality is you will necessarily have greater child mortality as you have better prenatal care. Because with better prenatal care, children are now surviving to birth who are sickly, who wouldn't necessarily have survived to birth later, and some of those will die and show up as infant mortality statistics that they would not have shown up at all had the prenatal care been worse and they not survived to term. So that's one thing to consider. Another thing to consider, particularly when people talk about how cheap healthcare is in other societies. I had this argument with someone on Facebook the other day. And the person was arguing, yes, healthcare is cheaper. So I was looking up the numbers for UK versus US. And I don't know the cost of the healthcare, so let's just take it at face value. Healthcare is dirt cheap in UK and expensive here. And the problem is, not that a socialist system gives you cheaper healthcare. It's that the socialist system is much better at hiding the cost. So if you compare the two societies, a middle class household in the UK, their income is taxed at a marginal rate of about 45% versus 20% in the US. Why the difference? Well, that's part of the cost of the healthcare. In Canada, if you want to get a CAT scan, it's on average a 4-week wait. An MRI on average is an 11-week wait. In the United States, if you come to the emergency room and you need a CAT scan or MRI, it's maybe a half-hour wait, if that, right? So two ways that you're paying for this quote-unquote free healthcare is through drastically higher taxes and through what economists call rationing, but real people would call having to wait. I've got to wait for treatment. Sometimes I have to wait so long that I die of whatever my malady is before I can get treated. Those are two very real costs.
Well, Richard Ferris, again, I appreciate your lack of feeling you're qualified, but really what most of us want isn't a book, it's a whole bunch of charts. And it doesn't matter which chart you prepare, it's got to start somewhere with somebody starting to show charts with the difference in results of care between Europe and America and the difference in these standards so that we have an awareness. Without somebody doing this work and putting it out there, how are we ever going to tell our fellow citizens that there's no such thing as a free lunch in healthcare?
Right.
Afternoon, gentlemen.
This is our last question? Okay.
Okay, I'll try and make it a good one. Good one for you guys to finish up on.
Step up your game, Tom.
So I'm actually asking this question as a recovering public high school educator myself. And I want to focus a little bit on what you guys are doing with Freedom Trust. Both of you having worked with FEE, with Learn Liberty, right? We're live streaming this right now. I want to know what you guys, from your perspective and the things that you guys are doing currently,
what can those of us who are in attendance here today do to help get these ideas into more classrooms, into a younger audience, and really make a difference before they get, or our kids get their heads filled with these wrong-headed ideas about, not just about how the difference between capitalism and socialism, but how market economies work in general. What can those of us here do to help assist in this program?
I mean, the most obvious thing is the thing I think nobody in this room needs to hear, and that's have dinner with your children and talk to them. And, you know, look, dinner at my house is a full contact sport. If you say something, you better bring your A game to back that up, because we're going to be asking for data at the table, right? That's right. So start there. But I don't stop there. I don't stop with my own children. I'll go after other people's children too. If they come over for dinner, well, we know how this is going to go. And I like to think that I prepare my children for when their parents do the same at their homes, right? Because I would like to see more robust forms of conversation. Right? Put your phones and your tablets down when we have dinner. It's to talk to each other. You can check your facts on the tablet later. But dinner is for arguing. And maybe that's the Italian part that my mother gave me, that we just have to argue at dinner or it doesn't count. But if we get past that, you know, what Ant and I do 50 or so times a year now when we go to high schools, we actually were shocked when we got there how great the teachers are. They were just fantastic, right? And the narrative you hear all the time, don't waste your time with teachers. We haven't wasted a minute with teachers. They're great. On the other hand, when we talk to them, what do they all tell us? Why are you no longer teaching, maybe? All I do all day, every day, is prepare my students for one test. And it takes away everything that I can give them. So my advice is don't go after the teachers, don't go after the school systems or the administrators. As is always the case, you should waste your efforts going after the politicians that would tell them what to do. And maybe try to work your best to turn education into a local proposition again. Is it perfect? No. Is it better? Absolutely.
On a more pragmatic note, to help get the word out, we go around and we pick our college, the high schools we go to simply by cold calling. So if you know a high school teacher who is interested in this sort of thing, put us in contact with them. We're happy to go to their high school.
Yeah, we'll go anywhere, anytime. Anywhere, anytime.
That's all we have time for. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.